rejecting a parent, and you want to know, is this child rejecting a parent because they've been manipulated by the other parent to unjustifiably reject the targeted parent, or are they rejecting the parent because that parent has engaged in egregious abuse, neglect, etc., that would cause a child to appropriately, realistically, justifiably reject a parent. If you have a child who's rejecting a parent, you cannot tell just based on that, the child with their hands on their hips, I hate my mommy or daddy, I don't want to see them anymore. You can't know just based on that one piece of information if the child is alienated, unjustifiably rejecting a parent, or estranged, justifiably rejecting a parent. So the way that we have sort of codified all the theoretical and practical and clinical and research knowledge that we have, the way we've codified that into a diagnostic framework is the four-factor model. And so the model says that 4 things need to be present in order to know that a rejecting child is alienated. All 4 have to be present. So we try to set the bar pretty high so that we are not placing or considering an abused child as an alienated child. Why do we care if a rejecting child is alienated or estranged, right? Maybe it doesn't matter, but it does. And the reason it matters is because the treatment would be very different. If you have a child rejecting an abusive parent, that is, they're an estranged child, the ideal clinical intervention would be what we call abuse-specific treatment, where the maltreating parent and the abused child are together in a way that supports the child's realistic, negative perceptions of the abusive parent, and the abusive parent atones for what they've done and modifies their parenting behavior. That's abuse-specific treatment. Alienation-specific treatment is where the child's negative perceptions of the rejected parent are considered distortions. Those distortions are challenged in a clinically appropriate way, and that is the focus of the alienation-specific treatment, is to help the child experience the rejected parent as safe, loving, and available. Because in the four-factor model we're ruling out abuse, that's factor 2. Factor 1 is that there was a prior positive relationship between the child and the now rejected parent, right? So that means that whatever the normative flaws are of that parent, it didn't prevent them from having a close, loving attachment bond to the child who's now rejecting them. So that's factor 1. So we want to sort of say, does that parent have the basic competencies? Did they put in the time and effort to establish an attachment with that child? So that's factor 1. Factor 2 is absence of abuse or neglect. So if you follow the model, there would be no way for an abused child to be considered alienated as long as we have accurate ways of determining if a parent has been abusive, right? So if you can rule out that the now rejected parent was abusive or neglectful, then you move on to factor 3 and factor 4. But we build into the model, if there was abuse, it can't possibly be alienation. So that's how we ensure that we don't misdiagnose children. Factor 1 is prior positive relationship. So we establish that the now rejected parent was a normative parent. Factor 2, absence of abuse or neglect. So we don't want any abusive parents being considered targeted parents. We don't want any abused kids to be considered alienated kids, right? Factor 3 is the favored parent has engaged in many of the 17 primary parental alienation strategies that we know foster a child's unjustified rejection of the other parent. We want to see, did that favored parent do the things that we know can cause alienation? And then factor 4 is that the child's actually acting like an alienated child. And there are 8 behaviors that differentiate alienated kids from non-alienated kids. And even kids who have been abused don't treat their abusive parent the way that alienated kids treat the targeted parent, who we've established through factor 1 and 2 has been a normative parent. So the 8 behavioral manifestations of alienation, that's the term that Richard Gardner used, and he is the person who identified or codified that list of 8 behaviors. So the first one is the campaign of denigration, and there's a lot packed into that. So the gist of the campaign of denigration, the way that I think about it, is past, present, and future. So if you ask an alienated child, tell me about a good memory you have of the parent that you're now rejecting. Let's say it's mom, just for the sake of consistency when I'm talking. Tell me about mom. Can you think of a good memory? You show the kid a photograph. This looks like you were having a good time with your mom here. An alienated child will generally say, I never had good times with that parent. I was pretending in that photograph, or that's not me, that's been photoshopped, or my mom said she would hurt me, if I didn't smile for the camera. So they erase the past. Even there are cases where the favorite parent will say, well, the mom used to be a good mom up until whatever. The kids are so sort of extreme that they will deny ever having a good memory with that parent. So that's the past. The present, these kids are hostile, rejecting, provocative, arrogant, entitled, rude, and nasty. In general, I'm not saying every child will have every one of those characteristics, but they don't just reject a parent, like, gee, mom, I don't really want to, live with you. I'm feeling, closer to dad. They're like, don't ever darken my doorway. You're a piece of garbage. I hate you. I hate everything about you. So it's very nasty behavior. And then the future, if you ask an alienated child, well, what could mom do to fix this? I think you had a good relationship. You're not so happy with her now. What does mom need to do to repair the relationship? They will generally say, nothing. I can't imagine ever wanting to have a relationship with her again. So that's just the first of the 8 behavioral manifestations, the campaign of denigration. These kids gleefully share with other people sort of a smear campaign of the targeted parent. So they can't wait to tell the judge, that their mother's a whore, their father's a monster. They sort of take pleasure in saying bad things about the targeted parent to other people. The second of the 8 is weak, frivolous, and absurd reasons. So if you ask an alienated child, like, what's the deal? Like, how come you won't even have a cup of cocoa with your mother on her birthday? What's your beef with her? The reasons they give generally are weak, frivolous, and absurd, and disproportionate to their complaints. So examples from real life cases I've worked on. I hate my father. I never want to see him again. The wooden floors in his house are scratched. Okay? Or my father's car smells like coffee. So I hate him and don't want a relationship with him ever again. Or my mother wears cowboy boots with skirts. And therefore she's dead to me. So it's, right, patently disproportionate. The level of hostility compared to the complaints, it just doesn't really make sense. The third is lack of ambivalence. So these kids see one parent is all good, the other is all bad, and really have a hard time even thinking of any criticisms of the favored parent. It is a facet of the human brain that we are hardwired to have, and not only to have, but to be able to have mixed feelings about people. In fact, the more we love somebody, the closer we are to them, the more likely we are to have mixed feelings, because the more likely they are to disappoint us. And so it's highly unnatural for a child to see one parent like literally as like a hero and the other as like a villain. So that's the third of the 8 behavioral manifestations. The fourth is lack of remorse for the really shoddy treatment of the targeted parent. So sometimes when people ask me what is parental alienation, and I don't want to give them like a technical definition, I'll say it's when one parent gives the child permission to break the other parent's heart. And these kids treat the targeted parent really badly. And it's brutal. You interview any targeted parents and that's what they're going to say, just how painful it is to be not just cut off from your child, but to be so invalidated, like you have no meaning to me. And these kids act as if they just don't care about the targeted parent's feelings. That's number 4. 5 is the independent thinker phenomenon. That means these kids go out of their way to protect the favored parent. At some point, these kids figure out that people think they've been brainwashed or programmed or whatever term we want to use or coached. And so they say things like, Mom, this has nothing to do with Dad. Don't even think that Dad had anything to do with this. This is all my own. I just came up with this. And then sort of, spew their hate. And it does seem to be that they want to really own it for themselves. The next one is use of borrowed scenarios. That means these kids repeat back phrases, ideas, beliefs, statements, whole paragraph scenarios that come from the favorite parent that, again, the child is sort of pretending and then eventually comes to believe for themselves that these are their ideas, even though they may not know the words they're saying, or they don't understand it, or they can't provide any examples. My favorite example is a child who told, gee, Dad, I don't want anything to do with you anymore, blah, blah, blah. Why? Well, I just want good childhood memories, right? I mean, it's just so ridiculous. Children just don't talk like that. They don't generally think they're entitled to only have good childhood memories, right? So it just has this totally pseudo feeling to it. The next one is reflexive automatic support for the favored parent. So one of the things I have said many times is that favored parents are sort of evil geniuses at figuring out the wiggle room and the gray area in court orders. That favored parents always take the advantage. They find that wiggle room and they claim every extra second for themselves. And no matter how preposterous the scenario is. I heard one case where the father told the child, because Monday comes after a weekend, it sort of bleeds into it, so Monday is now all of a sudden that parent's time, right? Like he's just sort of co-opted Monday as now being part of the weekend, and he used that phrase, it bleeds into, the weekend bleeds into Monday. And then the kid is using the borrowed scenario and saying, no, Monday bleeds into whatever. So my point is that the kids will take the favored parent's side in every interparental conflict. You could show them a piece of paper, no, here, you see this, and it doesn't matter. Their mind is made up. The favored parent is always right. And the final one, I think I'm up to number 8, is the spread of the animosity, so that eventually the kids, they start off with the campaign of denigration against the targeted parent. Ultimately, it spreads to their friends and family, neighbors, anybody who has anything good to say about the targeted parent is ultimately cut off by the kids. Even abused kids don't exhibit these behaviors, right? So I can go through each of the 8 and tell you, abused kids do not erase the past. They still can have positive memories of the abusive parent. They don't have weak, frivolous, and absurd reasons. They've actually been maltreated and they'll talk about it in a credible way. They don't lack ambivalence. They don't start worshiping the other parent like, well, mom beat me, so now dad's the hero. No, dad's still an imperfect dad. They can still see the good and the bad in both parents. They don't generally lack remorse. In therapy with maltreating kids, if you read all the books on how to do therapy with abused children, they talk about how hard it is to get the kids to confront the parent and, own that they're sort of mad that the parent hurt them. They're not just sort of wiping out the humanity of that parent. They don't take the other parent's side. If two parents disagree, they don't say, well, because mom beat me, she must be wrong about what day of the week it is. I mean, that's so, clear that they don't do that. They don't cut off the friends and family of the abusive parent. And we have lots and lots of threads of other research that shows that abused children don't reject the abusive parent. We have Harry Harlow's research with the primates, and he actually created this thing called the monster mother, these mechanical mothers who abuse their babies, and he found that the babies actually clung to the monster mothers more than baby monkeys raised by non-monster mothers. So abuse actually induced more proximity seeking and clinging behavior. There's there's several really important, credible strands of research that support that maltreating children don't reject their maltreating parent the way that alienated children reject their non-abusive parent. But we also just completed a research study to really bring another really important piece of data to the point. We surveyed 338 clinicians who have experience directly providing therapy to severely or moderately physically abused children. And we had them rate how often does it happen that you see severely. So we had some do severely, some do moderately. How often does it happen that you see, let's say, a specific severely physically abused child exhibit these behaviors? And we gave them the 8 behavioral manifestations of alienation. And it turns out it's very rare based on the clinical ratings of abused children, it's very rare that they're going to exhibit those 8 behavioral manifestations at the level that alienated kids do. So some of them do it some of the time, but if you ask how many of these kids do it very often, which is how often severely alienated kids are exhibiting these behaviors, the data is very, very clear that in general, maltreated kids do not behave like alienated children. In general, it has to do with the intensity and the number of those 8 behaviors. So sort of a shorthand is to say that mild kids, show some sort of challenging behaviors towards the targeted parent, but basically they're relating to that parent in a reality-based way. So they might be upset, but it's primarily based on the behavior of the targeted parent. They're coming for their visits. There's just sort of little hints that maybe sometimes they don't trust that parent, or they're sort of having some doubts, but it's basically at a low level. Moderate, these kids are resisting coming in general, and when they come, they're very challenging, but then eventually, if they have enough time, enough consecutive days together, they will settle into relating to the targeted parent based on the behaviors of that targeted parent. So one thing the targeted parents say to me is, it takes me a day to get my kid back. Right? So it's like, well, what do you mean? Well, they're very cold, they're distant, they're challenging, they act like they don't trust me and like me. And then once we've spent about a day together, they calm down and then they sort of come back. That's the way the targeted parents talk about it. Severely alienated kids either don't come at all, or if they come, they are shut down emotionally. So I've heard of cases where the kid literally brings a duffel bag, like, here's the water I'm going to drink, here's the food I'm going to eat, here are the sheets I'm going to sleep on. I want nothing from you, the targeted parent, and they go in their room and they spend the entire time on the phone with the favored parent. So they're there in body, so that the favored parent doesn't get in trouble for interfering in, the parenting time. But the kid is like a shell at that point. We also just completed a research study to really bring another really important piece of data to the point. We surveyed 338 clinicians who have experience directly providing therapy to severely or moderately physically abused children. Abused children, it's very rare that they're going to exhibit those 8 behavioral manifestations at the level that alienated kids do. But if you ask how many of these kids do it very often, which is how often severely alienated kids are exhibiting these behaviors, the data is very, very clear that in general, maltreated kids do not behave like alienated children. Mild kids, show some sort of challenging behaviors towards the targeted parent, but basically they're relating to that parent in a reality-based way. So they might be upset, but it's primarily based on the behavior of the targeted parent. They're coming for their visits. There's just sort of little hints that maybe sometimes they don't trust that parent, or they're sort of having some doubts, but it's basically at a low level. Moderate, these kids are resisting coming in general, and when they come, they're very challenging, but then eventually, if they have enough time, enough consecutive days together, they will settle into relating to the targeted parent based on the behaviors of that targeted parent. Severely alienated kids either don't come at all, or if they come, they are shut down emotionally. So they're there in body, so that the favored parent doesn't get in trouble for interfering in, the parenting time, but the kid is like a shell. And when the custody evaluator said, like, so, son, what's your beef with your mom, and he was hateful towards her, just broke her heart and treated her really, really badly. He said, it's just an intangible. He couldn't even be bothered to articulate what his problem was. So that's just sort of the most clear example of a weak, frivolous, and absurd reason. Thinking about the long-term and short-term effects of parental alienation, that's really where I started in the field, is wanting to know, what does this do to a child? Is this, not such a big deal? Is this a form of child abuse? We really didn't know from a research point of view, when I got interested in it as a researcher, was to really ask, like, what does this do to a person to go through this? And so I interviewed 40 adults who self-identified as having gone through this when they were a child. Of course, they didn't say, I'm an adult child of parental alienation, right? Because they didn't know that term. So I asked, when you were a child, did one parent turn you against the other parent? And I interviewed these 40 people at length. How did this affect you? What does this mean to you, having lived through this? How does alienation affect a child? That is a really important question, because you could believe, and certainly a judge could think, yes, it's real and yes, it's happening, but so what? It's not that big a deal. And what they talked about was really profound interference in the course of their life. None of them said, well, it wasn't that big a deal, or it hurt for a while, but then I got used to it. They all talked about it affecting profoundly their sense of who they are, how they felt about themselves, how they felt about the world, their ability to get along with other people, their ability to ultimately separate from the favorite parent who was smothering them and interrupting their development, because those parents wanted those kids to stay, dependent on them. So it affected their ability to be self-sufficient adults. So I got a really good sort of deep narrative insight into how it affects individuals to be turned against a parent by the other parent. So we can say fairly confidently that there are strong associations. The more exposure to parental alienation strategies, that's factor 3, the more likely the kids are to grow up to be depressed and anxious and have poor relationships and be stuck developmentally in their life. By the way, just like a cult person, you put somebody in a cult at 18 and they stay in a cult for 10 years, what do you get at the end? You get an 18-year-old. They've learned no life skills. It's sort of the same for many alienated kids. They get alienated and then they stay dependent. They're not learning critical thinking skills. They're not learning how to navigate interpersonal conflict and how to resolve things in a mutually respectful way. So the alienating parent is teaching these children the opposite of what we want children to grow up to be, right? Which is, happy and confident, separate people who have what we would consider to be good values of forgiveness and generosity and compassion. So at this point, I would say it's fairly settled science that exposure to alienation is associated with bad outcomes for these kids through adulthood. Parental alienation, in my opinion, and again established through research, is a form of psychological maltreatment. And severe parental alienation, therefore, would be severe psychological maltreatment. Targeted parents are living in an unending grief. And this is one of the things that they talk about is unresolved grief. In other words, if, God forbid, a child dies or a loved one dies, you go through various stages, not necessarily lockstep, step 1, 2, 3, 4, but ultimately you come to accept the reality, and the reality doesn't change. That person has passed away, and you learn ultimately to accept that reality and deal with it. For targeted parents who have lost a child who thankfully is still alive, it's a never-ending, aggravating grief in their life because they know their child is out there. So every day is a reminder that their child is growing and changing and developing, and they're being deprived the opportunity to help their child and have an influence to, it's one of the greatest pleasures of parenting is to be able to sort of see your child blossom in the ways that you're encouraging them to and helping them be good people and to navigate life, and all of that the targeted parents are deprived of. And on top of that, they are witnessing their child being abused, and they can do nothing to protect their children. And I would say probably on top of the grief of the sort of unsatisfied yearning to be with their child, which is very, very profound and intense, right up there in terms of intensity is the intense helplessness that they cannot protect their child from all the bad things that the favored parent is doing. So rather than sort of these children blossoming, they're kind of wilting under the care of the favored parent, and that's just profoundly frustrating, and that word doesn't just really begin to capture how painful it is for the targeted parent to go through that. When I'm coaching somebody, I'm very clear. We don't have any control over the other parent. I'm here to help you, and I do believe it is a system. If you change your behavior, it can change the behavior of the other people sort of indirectly. And so targeted parents are so sort of invalidated and feel so helpless. It can be empowering just to know that you can still grow and change as a parent, and that can possibly ultimately impact your child. And that is sort of my number one job as a targeted parent coach, is to help that parent hold the value that they have to their child simply by being that parent, because they're getting so many messages that you don't count and you don't matter, but they do. So one of my favorite stories is the adult alienated child who told me that when she was a kid, her mom got remarried, and the mom and the stepdad became the alienators, and they turned her against her dad. And every Sunday, he would come for visits, and he'd walk up the path, and he'd knock on the door, and they would sit on the other side of the door. "You're a jerk. We hate you. You're such a... we never want anything to do with you." And they did that because the mom and stepdad were telling them, your dad's a jerk, and he doesn't love you, and, we'll only love you if you... Whatever they said, they came to believe that he was no good, a rotten, no good guy. And eventually he stopped coming. And that's what targeted parents did until they sort of learned about parental alienation. So I asked this adult woman, what did it mean to you when your dad stopped coming? You'd been asking him, basically, go away. They actually put notes on the door, "You're a jerk, don't come back." And what she said has never left me. She said, "I was shocked. I never thought he would actually go away." And what I learned from that is that for her, from her point of view, the knock was proof that he loved her. She knew she wasn't going to be able to open the door and see him and have a visit, so she counted on that knock as a very powerful reminder that he was still there. From his point of view, if he drives over and gets out of his car and walks up the path and knocks on the door and the kids yell at him and he turns away, for him, that's a failure. He didn't realize that the knock was all that mattered to her. So seeing alienation from the child's point of view is really so important. And I've actually thought a lot about how to instill critical thinking skills into children. And that's a lot of what I do with targeted parents who still have access to the kids. So not severely alienated, but let's say mildly and moderately alienated. A lot of the coaching is how can the targeted parent interact differently with the child to help instill in the child the necessary skills to not fall into that distortion. I think targeted parents and other people can help instill in children compassion and forgiveness and integrity. And I do believe if children develop those three values, I think it will be much harder for them to become alienated. So I coach targeted parents to encourage their children to think of themselves as a compassionate person, not by saying to the child, "Do you want to be compassionate?" but by noticing when their child is already engaging in compassionate behavior and saying, "That was so compassionate of you." To talk about those values, because if a child cares about somebody else's feelings and is able to forgive them for their normative flaws, and has integrity, meaning they can be true to their experience, how they experience the targeted parent with their own eyes and ears and feelings, they're going to be much harder to alienate. We know that if a child comes up with an idea, him or herself, they're going to believe it much more than if you tell them. So you cannot just say to a child, you're alienated, you're a puppet, you're coached, you're brainwashed. Nobody likes to hear that. It actually backfires. And no, I'm thinking for myself. If the child comes to the targeted parent and says, I'm mad at you because, you stole my college money, a normal response, a completely rational response for a targeted parent would be to say, my kid is mad at me because he believes X. X is a lie. I didn't steal their college money, so all I have to do is show them I didn't steal their college money. So what do? They run and get the bank statement. No, look, the money's in the bank. Or how dare you say that? Look at everything I've done for you. Or how could you say that? You know that's a lie. Or who told you that? None of that works. You have to start from a place of compassion and notice that your child is upset, and you start there. There are ways to interact with the child that don't inadvertently reinforce the negative message that you're unsafe, unloving, and unavailable. So when your child is mad at you and you say, how dare you, or who told you that, what you are conveying to your child is, I care more about my reputation, or I care more about being right than the fact that you're standing in front of me suffering because you think I did something terrible. And so you inadvertently reinforce the negative message. And that's how the favored parents get the targeted parents to do their work for them. So it's a big part of my coaching is teaching parents how not to do that.